That's definitely hail.
So, thanks
That's
for
pretty
telling me
big
to put
hail.
my poor little lemon pillow out. A lot.
It's more now. Yeah, those are bigger than peas.
That's a grape. Maybe not quite a grape. Cranberry.
Yep, that's definitely hail.
So, thanks
That's
for telling
pretty
me
big
to put
hail.
my poor little lemon pillow out. A lot.
It's more now. Yeah, those are bigger than peas.
That's a grape. Maybe not quite a grape. Cranberry.
Good Friday afternoon. I'm meteorologist Nicole Hartford with this live weather update here on 11 Alive Plus. It's been a very active afternoon across North Georgia, especially north of the Atlanta metro. We've been tracking these showers and storms that really bubbled up shortly after lunchtime and intensified very rapidly. They're still moving across our far northern counties, stretching from Floyd County up towards the northeast up to Habersham County, where that is our currently one severe thunderstorm warning. Otherwise, all of these thunderstorms have dropped down below severe criteria. These were pretty big hailers across a good portion of the area. Most of the reports that we saw and pictures that came in were of about dime to nickel sized hail or smaller, but in many locations it was large quantities of it. These are our hail tracks just from the last hour, showing where some of the larger hail was indicated. Now, these are radar indicated up to about an inch to even an inch and a half in some spots, but we have no actual reports of anyone seeing any hail that large. So if you do have photos or videos that you took of hail in your neck of the woods, especially if it's up larger in size, closer to quarter sized, definitely snap a picture of it or send those pictures our way and we'll get them to the National Weather Service. As far as the hail tracks go, we saw some pulsing of these storms on far eastern Floyd County and then also into portions of northern Cherokee County. Some earlier storms were also bringing hail across North Fulton County into the Alpharetta area. I mentioned we've got one severe thunderstorm warning. This is until 2:30 for Habersham as well as Stevens County. So this storm is moving out of our area and into South Carolina. It is still producing gusty wind as well as heavy rainfall and yes, some hail. We're going to be on the lookout for storms that do get up to the stronger to kind of severe side pretty quickly throughout the next couple of hours. We'll be tracking multiple rounds of rainfall through today into tonight as well as tomorrow morning, and it's all associated with an incoming cold front. So far today, most of the rainfall has really focused north of I-20. That's where we've seen most of our storm development, but it's pretty active all across the southeast thanks to this passing front. Still got a ways to go. It's not actually going to arrive in North Georgia until tomorrow. Once this cold front moves through, you can see behind it, there's much drier conditions, a lot less rainfall. So we do have drier conditions on the horizon, rainfall coming to an end by the end of the weekend. But as I mentioned, we've got multiple rounds of storms to get through today, tonight, and tomorrow before that rainfall finally comes to an end. This will bring not only the risk for showers and storms, but a threat for severe weather. There are a number of severe thunderstorm warnings that stretch along this cluster of storms from Texas into Louisiana, as well as Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and even into the Kentucky and Louisville area. This will continue to move eastward throughout the day today. So we'll be shifting gears in the next couple hours to start tracking these showers and storms that develop into portions of Alabama that will be arriving later this evening and overnight. The biggest risk for severe weather will be to our west and up towards the northwest, where this level 3 risk extends through Texas and then up into Tennessee and Kentucky. A little sliver of the far northwestern corner of the state is included in that level 3 threat. So portions of far western Floyd County as well as Chattooga County are in that. The rest of our area, Metro Atlanta included, in a level 1 to level 2 risk for storms. So we're talking isolated activity that could get up to severe criteria, primarily in the way of gusty winds as well as hail. Now, our tornado threat is low, but it's not zero, so that's something we'll also be looking for into this evening and overnight tonight. More showers and storms linger into tomorrow. Severe weather threat still there, but maybe not quite as prominent, with a level 1 risk across the area for, again, isolated storms that could become locally intense with some heavier rain, frequent lightning, as well as gusty winds and hail. Bottom line, if you have plans, especially outdoor plans today or tomorrow, you need to stay weather aware, and I would advise just have that way to get the watches and warnings as they are issued, especially into the overnight hours, a way that will wake you up if necessary with some of those severe thunderstorm warnings, or if there is a tornado warning, which very low risk. Forecast Track breaks this down hour by hour, shows those pop-up showers and storms continuing through the rest of the afternoon. So we're not really talking widespread rainfall for everyone throughout the daytime hours, but we'll be watching those showers and storms off towards the west for their arrival after about sunset tonight. So this is by 9 o'clock this evening. That cluster of showers and storms starts to push in. A lot of this will be dependent on exactly what takes place through Tennessee and through Alabama as we get closer to the arrival of these thunderstorms. Notice there are a number of pockets of some darker oranges and reds showing up on our forecast track, but it is not widespread. That indicates the isolated areas where we could perhaps see some stronger to even severe storms. That first round of storms later this evening winds down through the overnight. So by the time you're waking up tomorrow morning, a little bit of a lull in activity, but we're already tracking another round of showers and storms that will be moving in throughout the day on Saturday. We'll see multiple waves of rainfall, likely a little calmer and lighter in the morning, and then our risk for showers and thunderstorms that are a little stronger does go up into the afternoon as well as the evening. Scattered showers and storms anticipated just kind of on and off throughout the day on Saturday, with eventually drier conditions behind our cold front as we get into Saturday night and Sunday morning. Conditions right now across North Georgia vary widely. It has looked stormy. This is our camera view from Northside Hospital. I've been watching this the last couple hours as that storm developed in North Fulton County and moved into Forsyth. And this has brought, again, heavy rainfall at times, but it still looks kind of stormy across really north of Atlanta as we look towards the King and the Queen. This is our view currently in Rome. Similar view, kind of a stormy gray view. And that's what our view is across most of North Georgia, especially north of I-20. Throughout the next couple hours, we'll keep those storm chances. Temperature-wise, it's been really mild today. It's still been muggy, and a lot of spots we're actually enjoying a little bit of rain-cooled air, but temperatures still managed to get up into the upper 70s and the low 80s. Our cold front moves through tomorrow, so that'll keep highs only in the 70s for Saturday and into Sunday, and we'll actually get to enjoy some slightly lower humidity behind that cold front by Sunday morning. This is going to make it feel a lot more comfortable, and it will have a pretty big impact on those overnight low temperatures, our morning lows. Notice that this morning, tomorrow morning will be in the low 60s. We fall down into the low 50s by Monday morning. So a little crisper, a little cooler, perhaps a little more spring-like. We will continue to track those showers and storms through today and tomorrow. You can join us here live for more updates on 11 Alive Plus, or catch us on air with Chief Meteorologist Chris Holcomb doing shows from 4 p.m. until 6:30, and then again later this evening at 11 o'clock. We'll also have updates here as warranted as those showers and storms develop on 11 Alive Plus. Weather in North Georgia changes quickly, and when storms develop, you could see hail. Hail often forms when it's warm outside, not cold. It all has to do with temperatures higher up in the atmosphere. When thunderstorms develop, air rises, creating upward winds called updrafts. These updrafts carry particles of water up into the atmosphere where temperatures in the upper levels of the clouds are below freezing. The water particles freeze into little pellets of ice that we call hail. As the hailstones bounce around in the cloud, they fall below the freezing line, accumulate a layer of water, or bump into other hailstones, then rise back above the freezing line, freeze, and get bigger. This process continues until the hail is too heavy to be held up by the updrafts and they fall to the ground. Stronger updrafts mean bigger hail. In order for hail to be considered severe, it must be 1 inch or larger. That's about quarter sized. And if you see that, let us know by joining our Facebook group. Just search 11 Alive Weather Impact Team.
the expression, April showers bring May flowers. But is there any truth to that? According to the National Weather Service rainfall scorecard, April isn't even the rainiest month of the year in Atlanta. July, with all those summer pop-up storms, has the highest amount of rainfall average, followed by March and January. April actually ranks 10th out of all the months, but we said April showers, not storms.
And we do see more short, intense rain showers popping up in Georgia in the spring as the jet stream's band of strong winds shifts north, changing air pressure.
At the same time, the hemisphere is beginning to warm up and the sun angle increases around the spring equinox in late March. All that creates the perfect conditions for isolated showers, with April's rain and sunshine providing flowering plants the nutrients they need to grow. Here in Georgia, we see flowers start to bloom well before May, but good luck getting everyone to adopt March showers, bringing April flowers when some other parts of the country are still seeing snow.
now just 1 month away from the start. Oh, sorry. 3, 2. We are now just 1 month away from the start of hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin and just over 2 weeks away from the start in the Eastern Pacific. This is a look at the timeline of how many storms we typically see throughout the hurricane season, and the taller that the bar gets, that's the more frequency that we see, or the more number of storms that we've seen over times over a 100-year period. So the season starts June 1st. It's actually not unusual for us to see a storm before June 1st. We have seen over the last decade about a handful of storms that have happened before the official start of hurricane season, but activity really starts to ramp up closer to that September 10th peak of hurricane season. So between August, September, and October, we see more tropical cyclones on average, but the season keeps going. We do not see the end of hurricane season officially until November 30th. So that's a look at the tropical timeline. In yellow, that's the number of hurricanes, and in red, that's all tropical cyclones. So tropical storms and hurricanes, with hurricane winds being at least 74 miles per hour or greater, and tropical storms being at least 39 up to 74 miles per hour. All right. Storm names, here they are. There's actually only one of these names that is new for this year, replaced from 6 years ago back in 2019. That was Dorian. So the new storm name there is Dexter, but all the rest of these names, Andrea, Barry, Chantal, we have had these before, and you may recognize some of those names because some of these have impacted places over the last times that they've been cycled through. All right, this year, the Hurricane Center is making some updates, and I've actually got a web article on 11alive.com so you can read a lot more about these, but I've listed some of the updates that they're going to do to the products that they're issuing for these named systems. Number one, the cones of uncertainty. These now include inland tropical storm watches, tropical storm warnings, hurricane watches and warnings, but in addition to that, like they had last year, this year, they're going to overlay on top of each other when some places have, say, a tropical storm warning and a hurricane watch. They'll put both of those colors on the map to designate that condition. If it's large enough, it's going to churn up the swells, and rip currents can be very dangerous. So they'll have a threat map out that's going to show where those rip current threats are going to be greatest as tropical cyclones move through the Gulf and also through the Atlantic. Potential tropical cyclones, you've heard of those the last couple of years. Those have typically been issued up to 48 hours before the arrival time of one of those tropical storms or hurricanes, but now they're going to be issued 72 hours in advance. So if they know this thing could become a hurricane and that's going to mean impacts, they're going to issue that cone of uncertainty, put out a potential tropical cyclone path earlier. That helps decision makers and folks who need to decide, am I going to evacuate? Am I going to board up my home? All of that. And with that being said, they'll also issue those wind radii, showing the wind field of these storms now up to 3 days out. And those cones of uncertainty that they issue get a little bit smaller each year as their forecasts get more accurate. Now, NOAA doesn't officially issue its hurricane outlook for the season until later this month, but Colorado State University did last month in April, and they're calling for a slightly more than average activity in the Atlantic. 17 named storms, 9 of those becoming hurricanes and 4 becoming major hurricanes. That's a little bit above these numbers, which are the average, the climatological averages over that 30-year period from 1991 to 2020. Colorado State University also just puts out these forecasts for major hurricane strikes. So what are the odds we're going to see a major hurricane strike anywhere in the United States? Well, they're saying there's a greater than 50% chance, a 51% chance there could be a major hurricane landfall, 25% chance that could happen on the East Coast, and a 33% chance of a Gulf Coast major hurricane strike, with the Gulf Coast being anywhere from Brownsville, Texas, all the way around to the Florida Keys. Okay. Why are they calling for that slightly higher than average activity? Well, a lot of this has to do with ocean temperatures in the Atlantic Basin, but it also has to do with what phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation we're in. This is one of those things that sounds very abstract, but let me kind of lay this out for you. We look at, for El Nino, what's happening with the ocean waters near the equator in the eastern Pacific Ocean, in this blue box area. When they're warmer than average, we have an El Nino. When they're cooler than average, we have a La Nina. And when they're near normal, it's called enso-neutral. And we're coming out of a La Nina. We're now in enso-neutral conditions. And so that means that we're not going to have this pendulum swing of one way or the other of wind shear.
When we have La Nina conditions, we see less wind shear. When we have El Nino conditions, we see more wind shear. And that wind shear can be a major disruptor to tropical cyclone formation, might not allow tropical cyclones, tropical storms and hurricanes to form in the first place, or tropical storms and hurricanes to get stronger. That's because wind shear, this is changing of wind speed or wind direction with height, can disrupt storm flow in tropical storms and in hurricanes. So that can inhibit them getting stronger or forming in the first place. So I know I showed you a lot of data. What you really need to take away is we're 1 week from the start, but every year is different, and it only takes one storm to make it a bad year. Last year for us, that storm was Helene. Devastating flooding in Atlanta, East Georgia, significant winds, and we saw inland hurricanes. And those are the three major threats that we see from landfalling tropical systems here in Georgia.